The snow came down so fast that Mira could not see her own hands in front of her face. She had been walking for almost an hour, and the wind cut through her thin coat like a blade made of ice. Somewhere behind her, the lights of her pack's village had already disappeared into the white haze. She was alone, and the cold was not the only thing pressing down on her chest. A sound reached her ears through the roaring wind. It was faint, almost buried beneath the howling gusts, but it was there, a groan. A low, pained groan that did not belong to the storm. Mira froze. Her instincts told her to turn back, to run home before the blizzard swallowed her whole. But something else, something stronger than fear, pulled her forward. She pushed through a wall of snow and found herself standing at the edge of a ravine she had never noticed before, hidden behind a curtain of frozen pine branches. Down in the ravine, half buried in snow, lay a group of wolves. She counted 5, then 6. Then a 7th figure slumped against a boulder. None of them moved. Their fur was matted with ice, and one of them, a huge wolf with dark fur streaked silver at the edges, had a deep gash along his side that had stopped bleeding only because the cold had frozen it shut. Her heart pounded. These were not wolves from her pack. She did not recognize a single face among them, and their scent was unfamiliar, sharp with the metallic tang of blood and the earthy smell of a territory far from her own. Strangers. Dangerous strangers, perhaps. Her pack had taught her to fear outsiders, to distrust anyone who did not carry the mark of her own alpha. But they were dying. She could see it in the way their chests barely rose and fell, in the blue tint creeping into their lips. If she left them here, the storm would finish what it had started, and by morning there would be nothing left but shapes buried under fresh snow. Mira had spent her whole life being told she was worth nothing. An Omega, they called her, spitting the word like it was something dirty. She was the lowest rank in her pack, the one nobody wanted, the one who ate last and spoke least. Her parents had died when she was young, and without them to shield her, the pack had decided her place was beneath everyone else. She had grown used to being invisible. She had grown used to being told she could do nothing of value. But looking down at those frozen bodies, she felt something rise inside her that she had not felt in years. It was not fear. It was purpose. She scrambled down the slope, ignoring the way the icy rocks tore at her palms. The first wolf she reached was small, a young woman with light brown fur, barely more than a girl. Mira pressed 2 fingers to her neck and felt a weak pulse flutter beneath her skin. Alive. Barely, but alive. There was no time to think about danger anymore. Mira began to work. She remembered everything the pack healer had once taught her, back when she was still allowed to sit in on lessons before they decided an Omega did not need to know such things. She knew that the greatest danger was not the cold itself, but the slow shutting down of the body, the way blood pulled away from the skin to protect the heart. She knew that fire and shelter were more important than food, and that moving too quickly could be as deadly as not moving at all. The cave. She remembered a hollow in the rock she had discovered months ago while gathering herbs, tucked into the hillside less than 100 steps from where she now stood. It was small, but it would block the wind, and that alone might be the difference between life and death for these strangers. One by one, she dragged them. The young woman first, since she was lightest, then a broad-shouldered man with a wound across his shoulder, then 2 more men who groaned when she pulled them, which she took as a good sign, since the dead did not groan. Her arms burned, her legs shook, and more than once she slipped and fell into the snow, but she forced herself back up every time. She thought of nothing except the next step, and the one after that, and the one after that. The last wolf, the huge one with the frozen gash along his side, was by far the heaviest. Mira strained against his weight, wrapping her arms beneath his shoulders and pulling with everything she had left. Her muscles screamed in protest. For one terrible moment she thought she would not be able to move him at all, that he would be the one she failed to save. Then, gritting her teeth, she thought of every time she had been told she was too weak, too small, too worthless to matter. She thought of every meal she had eaten alone, every glance that slid past her like she was a ghost. Anger and grief twisted together inside her chest, and she used that fire to pull one final time. He slid free of the snowbank, and together they tumbled the last few feet into the shelter of the cave. Mira collapsed beside him for only a moment, before forcing herself back onto her feet. There was no time to rest. 7 wolves lay scattered across the small cave floor, and every single one of them was slipping closer to death with each passing minute. She built a fire first, gathering the driest branches she could find near the cave entrance, and striking flint against stone until sparks caught in the kindling. The flame was small at first, flickering weakly against the howling wind outside, but she fed it patiently, shielding it with her own body until it grew strong enough to survive on its own. Next came the wounds. She tore strips of cloth from her own coat, wrapping them tightly around the worst injuries to stop what little bleeding remained. She had no proper medicine, no herbs prepared for healing, but she remembered which plants near the ravine had numbing properties, and she pressed crushed leaves against the deepest cuts to ease the pain. The huge wolf with the frozen wound stirred slightly as she worked on him, his eyes fluttering half open before closing again. Up close, she could see the strength etched into every line of his body, the kind of strength that came from years of battle rather than luck. Even unconscious, even wounded, there was something commanding about him, something that made her hands move a little more carefully around his injuries. She did not know his name. She did not know any of their names, but she knew that if she stopped now, all of it would have been for nothing. Hour after hour she moved between them, checking pulses, adjusting blankets made from her own spare clothing, feeding the fire, pressing snow to fevered foreheads and warm stones to freezing hands. She gave them the last of the dried meat she carried in her pack, breaking small pieces into their mouths even though her own stomach ached with hunger. She did not eat a single bite herself. There was not enough, and she told herself she could survive one more day without food. She was used to that, after all. Outside, the storm raged on, unrelenting, as if trying to punish her for interfering with its plans. Snow piled higher against the cave entrance, and more than once Mira had to dig it away to keep the opening clear enough for fresh air to reach the fire. Her fingers went numb, her lips cracked from the cold, but she kept moving, kept working, kept fighting for lives that were not her own. As the hours passed, Mira found herself studying the strangers more closely, even as she worked to keep them alive. There was something different about the way they were dressed, the way even their torn and bloodied clothing carried marks she had never seen before, symbols stitched into collars and cloaks that spoke of a rank far beyond anything in her own pack. She had grown up believing that the world outside her village was small, that no pack mattered beyond the borders she had known since birth. Yet here were 7 strangers who carried themselves, even unconscious, like people used to being obeyed. She thought about waking one of them to ask questions, to learn who they were, and why they had ended up broken and freezing in a forgotten ravine. But she decided against it. Whatever had happened to them, whatever battle or disaster had left them like this, they needed rest more than they needed to answer a stranger's curiosity. There would be time for questions later, if any of them survived to answer them. The broad-shouldered man with the wound across his shoulder began to shiver uncontrollably sometime past midnight, and Mira feared the worst. She pressed her palms against his chest and felt his heartbeat stutter unevenly beneath her hands. Panic rose in her throat, but she forced it down, remembering the lessons she had clung to for years despite being told they were wasted on someone like her. She repositioned him closer to the fire, wrapped another layer of cloth around his shoulder, and pressed warm stones wrapped in fabric against his sides until his shivering slowly began to ease. "Do not die," she whispered under her breath, more to herself than to him. "Not after everything." She moved to check on the 2 men who had groaned earlier, relieved to find their breathing had steadied slightly. One of them, younger than the others with a scar running along his jaw, mumbled something in his sleep, words she could not quite make out, but his voice carried a tone of loyalty and worry, as though even in unconsciousness his thoughts remained fixed on someone else in the group. Mira glanced toward the huge wolf near the fire, the one whose gash had frightened her the most when she first found him. His breathing had grown steadier over the past hour, and though his face remained pale beneath the firelight, there was a stubborn strength in the way his jaw was set even in sleep, as if he refused to surrender even to unconsciousness. She reached out and adjusted the cloth around his wound, careful not to disturb the fragile stitching she had managed to create, using strips of thread pulled from her own sleeve. Her fingers brushed against his skin, and despite the cold radiating from his body, she felt an odd warmth pass between them, as though some part of him recognized the care being given, even while the rest of him remained lost in darkness. Outside, the wind seemed to grow louder, rattling against the rocks that sheltered them, and Mira pulled her thinning coat tighter around her shoulders. She had given away nearly every spare piece of clothing she carried, wrapping the strangers in whatever warmth she could spare, leaving herself with barely enough to keep her own trembling body from succumbing to the cold. She told herself it did not matter. She had survived worse. She had survived years of being forgotten, years of scraps and empty promises, and she would survive one more long night if it meant these strangers lived to see morning. The fire dimmed slightly, and she rose on stiff, aching legs to gather more wood from the pile she had stacked near the entrance. Each trip outside into the storm felt like stepping into a wall of ice, but she forced herself forward again and again, refusing to let the flame die while there was still breath left in anyone inside that cave. Near what she guessed was the middle of the night, the young woman with light brown fur stirred and opened her eyes. She looked around in confusion, taking in the fire, the cave, the strange girl kneeling beside her with blood and dirt smeared across her hands. "Where am I?" the young woman whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. "You are safe," Mira answered softly. "Just rest. I will take care of everything." The young woman's eyes drifted toward the others, toward the huge wolf still lying unconscious near the fire, and something like fear flickered across her face before exhaustion pulled her back under. Mira did not know what that fear meant. She did not know who these wolves were, or why they had been so badly injured, or what enemy had left them scattered and dying in a ravine far from any territory she recognized. All she knew was that morning felt impossibly far away, and that every single life in this cave depended entirely on her. She pressed another cloth against the huge wolf's wound, and watched his chest rise and fall in slow, shallow breaths. Whatever happened next, whoever these strangers turned out to be, she had made her choice the moment she heard that first groan through the storm. She would not let them die. Not tonight. Not while she still had strength left in her body. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and Mira kept working through the darkest hours of the night, refusing to let exhaustion win, refusing to let the cold take what she had fought so hard to save. Mira jolted awake at the sound of movement near the fire. She had not meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had finally overpowered her sometime before dawn, pulling her down into a shallow, uneasy rest. Her eyes snapped open to find the huge wolf, the one whose wound had frightened her the most, now sitting upright, his dark eyes fixed directly on her. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across his face, and Mira felt her breath catch in her throat. Up close, awake, he looked even more imposing than she had imagined, his presence filling the small cave as though the walls themselves had shrunk around him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and rough from disuse, carrying an authority that made the question feel less like curiosity and more like a command. Mira scrambled to sit up straighter, suddenly conscious of her torn coat and dirt-streaked hands. "My name is Mira," she answered carefully. "I found you and your companions in the ravine last night. You were freezing. I brought you here." His eyes swept across the cave, taking in the sleeping bodies of his companions, the makeshift bandages wrapped around their wounds, the fire that had clearly been tended through the night. Something shifted in his expression, though Mira could not quite name what it was, suspicion perhaps, or disbelief. "You did this alone," he said. It was not really a question. "There was no one else to help," she replied simply. "I could not leave you there." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and searching, as though trying to find some hidden motive behind her words. Mira held his stare, too tired to feel intimidated, too drained from the night's work to care much about how she appeared. She had done what needed to be done. Whatever judgment he passed on her now would not change that. Finally, he spoke again. "My name is Kale. The wolves you saved are my companions. We were traveling when we were ambushed, and the storm caught us before we could reach shelter." "Ambushed," Mira repeated, the word settling uneasily in her chest. "By who?" Kale's jaw tightened, and for a moment his expression darkened with something that looked like restrained anger. "That is not something I can share with a stranger," he said, though his tone carried less harshness than his words suggested. "Just know that you saved more lives than you realize." Mira nodded slowly, deciding not to press further. She rose to check on the others, moving carefully around the sleeping bodies to avoid disturbing their rest. The young woman with light brown fur was still asleep, her breathing steady now, color slowly returning to her cheeks. The broad-shouldered man's shivering had stopped entirely, and his pulse, when she checked it, beat strong and even beneath her fingers. As she moved, she felt Kale's eyes following her every step, watching the way she checked wounds with practiced care, the way she adjusted blankets and stoked the fire without needing to be asked. She did not know it, but her quiet competence was slowly chipping away at every assumption he had walked into this cave believing. "You know healing," Kale said eventually, his voice quieter now. "I was taught. A long time ago," Mira answered, not elaborating further. She did not feel like explaining how those lessons had been taken from her, how she had been told an Omega did not deserve such knowledge, how she had clung to fragments of memory simply because no one could take memories away the way they had taken everything else. Kale did not ask her to explain, though something in his expression suggested he sensed there was more beneath her simple answer. Instead, he shifted slightly, wincing as pain flared through his side, and Mira was immediately at his shoulder, gently pressing him back down. "You should not move yet," she said firmly. "Your wound is deep. If you tear it open again, you will lose more blood than your body can afford to lose." For a moment, Cale looked almost amused, as though he was not used to being told what to do, especially not by someone so much smaller than himself. But something about her tone, direct and unafraid despite his size and clear authority, made him settle back against the cave wall without argument. "You give orders easily, for someone who claims to be nobody important," he said, a faint edge of curiosity in his voice. Mira paused, her hands still hovering near his shoulder. "I am not giving orders," she said quietly. "I am telling you the truth, because it matters more than manners right now." Cale studied her again, longer this time, and something in his gaze softened, just slightly. Around them, the fire crackled steadily, and outside, the storm had finally begun to weaken, the howling wind softening into a gentler, quieter fall of snow. One by one, the others began to stir throughout the morning. The young woman with light brown fur woke fully first, blinking around in confusion before her eyes landed on Cale and widened with relief. She tried to rise too quickly, wincing at the movement, and Mira was there instantly, easing her back down with careful hands. "Slowly," she said gently. "Your body needs time." The young woman, whose name Mira would later learn was Sienna, stared at her with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Did you do all of this?" she asked, gesturing weakly toward the bandages, the fire, the shelter itself. Mira nodded, focusing on adjusting the cloth around Sienna's arm, rather than meeting her eyes. "It was nothing," she murmured. "It was not nothing," Sienna said firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You saved us. All of us." Across the cave, the broad-shouldered man stirred next, followed by the two younger men who had groaned the night before. Each of them woke in stages, disoriented and weak, but alive, every single one of them alive because Mira had refused to let the storm win. As they came to understand what had happened, what this stranger had done for them through the long, freezing night, the atmosphere in the cave shifted from confusion to something closer to disbelief. Cale watched it all unfold from where he sat, his dark eyes moving between his recovering companions and the quiet, unassuming girl who had somehow managed to save every single one of them without asking for anything in return. He had led warriors his entire life, had seen loyalty bought and sold, had seen kindness twisted into strategy more times than he could count. But this felt different. This felt like something rare, something he had almost forgotten still existed in the world. By midday, the storm outside had finally passed entirely, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in fresh, undisturbed snow that sparkled beneath weak winter sunlight. The cave, once filled with dying strangers, now held 7 wolves, slowly returning to strength, bound together by a single act of selfless courage they had not expected and could scarcely believe. Mira moved among them, distributing the last of the dried meat she carried, insisting each of them eat before she considered her own hunger. When Sienna noticed and tried to press a share back into her hands, Mira gently refused. "You need it more right now," she said simply. "I will find food later." Sienna's eyes glistened, though she said nothing more, simply nodding and watching the quiet girl move on to check the others. Near the fire, Cale remained seated, his side still bound tightly, his strength slowly returning with each passing hour. He watched Mira work without pause, without complaint, without a single request for gratitude or reward, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time since waking, exactly who this girl truly was, and why fate had placed her in that ravine, at the exact moment his life, and the lives of his closest companions, had hung by nothing more than a single thread. Morning light broke through the mouth of the cave in pale streaks, and with it came the sound of boots crunching rapidly through fresh snow outside. Mira's head snapped up from where she had finally allowed herself to rest, her body instantly tense. "Someone's coming," she whispered. Cale was already on his feet, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone who had nearly frozen to death only hours before. He positioned himself near the cave entrance, his posture shifting into something sharp and ready, though his injuries clearly still pained him. "Stay back," he told the others, and though his voice remained calm, there was no mistaking the authority behind it. Even Finn, still weak from the cold, straightened immediately at the command. The footsteps grew closer, and then a voice called out, breathless and urgent. Cale, are you in there?" Cale's shoulders relaxed slightly at the sound. "Owen," he called back. "We're here. Everyone is alive." A man stumbled into view at the cave entrance, his face pale with worry, snow clinging to his cloak and hair. He looked younger than Kale, perhaps by only a few years, but he carried himself with the same alert bearing as the others in the group. "We searched half the night once the storm broke enough to move," Owen said, his eyes sweeping across the cave, taking in each face with visible relief. "We feared the worst when we found the ravine, and no sign of any of you." "We would have died there," Kale said plainly, "if not for her." Owen's gaze finally landed on Mira, and something in his expression shifted from relief to confusion, and then, slowly, to something like disbelief. "You," Owen said, taking a step closer, studying her more carefully. "You pulled them out? All of them?" "I did what I could," Mira said, feeling suddenly self-conscious under the weight of his stare. Owen turned back to Kale, and in his haste, in his obvious relief at finding his companions alive, the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "The pack has been in chaos all night, my lord. Word spread quickly once we realized the Alpha King himself was missing in the storm. Everyone feared the worst." The words hung in the air like a physical weight, and Mira felt her entire body go still. Alpha King. She turned slowly to look at Kale, her mind racing to reconcile the quiet, careful man who had asked her questions with genuine curiosity, who had thanked her without any hint of superiority, with the title Owen had just spoken aloud. Kale's expression had gone tense, his jaw tightening as he shot Owen a look that clearly communicated his displeasure at the slip, but the damage, if it could even be called that, was already done. "You're the Alpha King," Mira said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mira. The Alpha King of the Northern Wolves. She took an unconscious step backward, her mind reeling through every interaction from the previous night, every casual conversation she had shared with him, as though he were simply another wolf caught in the same storm. "I ordered you around. I told you to stay back. I made you drink boiled snow water out of a cracked cup. And every bit of it kept me alive," Kale said, stepping toward her, though he kept enough distance to avoid crowding her. "None of that has changed, simply because you now know my title." But Mira could feel the old instincts rising in her chest, the years of training that told her exactly how she was supposed to behave in the presence of someone of such immense standing. She lowered her gaze instinctively, her shoulders curling inward, and began to shift into the posture she had been taught since childhood, the posture of deference, of smallness, of knowing her place. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I didn't know. If I had realized, I never would have spoken to you so plainly. I never would have." "Stop that." The sharpness in Kale's voice startled her into silence. When she looked up, his gray eyes held none of the coldness she expected, only something that looked almost like frustration, though not directed at her. "Do not do that," he said, more gently this time. "Do not shrink away from me now, simply because you've learned a title. You treated me as an equal when you believed I was nothing more than a stranger caught in a storm, and that treatment is precisely what kept me alive. I have no interest in you suddenly treating me differently now." "But it's not proper," Mira said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Someone of my rank doesn't address someone of yours the way I did last night." "Someone of your rank," Kale repeated, his tone sharpening slightly, though still not unkind. "Pulled 6 wolves from a blizzard, with nothing but her own strength and determination. I don't particularly care what title your pack has assigned you. I care about what I witnessed with my own eyes." Elena, who had been watching the exchange with quiet interest, spoke up gently. "He means it, Mira. Kale has never been one for empty words." Mira glanced around at the others, at Finn and Owen and the rest, all of them watching her with expressions that held nothing but genuine respect, none of the dismissiveness she had grown so accustomed to receiving from her own kind. "I don't understand," she admitted quietly. "In my pack, rank determines everything. How you're treated, what you're allowed to do, whether your voice matters in any conversation of importance. I've spent my entire life being told that my rank makes me less than everyone around me." "Then your pack has taught you something false," Kale said, his voice firm, but not harsh. "Strength is not measured by rank. I have seen wolves born into positions of great power, who could not have survived one night of what you endured for strangers. Rank is simply a word. What you did last night was real." Something in his conviction settled the panic in Mira's chest, though the instinct to retreat into smallness did not fully disappear. It had been drilled into her too deeply, over too many years, to vanish after a single conversation. "I still don't know how to simply forget what I learned this morning," she admitted. "You're the Alpha King. That's not a small thing to set aside. You don't have to forget it," Kale said. "Just don't let it change how you carry yourself. That's all I'm asking." Owen, still watching the exchange with visible curiosity, cleared his throat gently. My lord, the pack will want to know you're safe as soon as possible. We should begin moving while the weather holds. Kale nodded, though his attention remained on Mira a moment longer before he turned to address the group properly. Owen is right. We need to move quickly before another storm rolls in. Everyone gather what strength you have left. The group began preparing to leave the small cave that had sheltered them through the worst of the night, gathering cloaks and checking on each other's injuries with the easy familiarity of wolves who had clearly served together for a long time. Mira moved to help where she could, though her mind remained tangled in everything she had just learned. As they stepped outside into the pale morning light, the storm having finally passed entirely, leaving behind a landscape of pristine, blinding white snow, Kale fell into step beside her rather than moving ahead with his own group as she expected. Where will you go now? He asked. Back to your pack? Eventually, Mira said, though I'm sure they've hardly noticed my absence. Something flickered across Kale's expression at that. Something she could not quite read, though it looked uncomfortably close to anger. They don't know you're missing? I doubt it, Mira admitted. I often go out alone to gather herbs. No one typically checks on my whereabouts. Kale said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon ahead of them. That will change, he said finally, though he did not elaborate on what he meant, and Mira found herself too tired, too overwhelmed by everything the morning had already revealed, to press him for further explanation. They walked together in silence for a while, the rest of the group trailing slightly behind, speaking quietly among themselves about the ordeal they had survived. Mira could feel Owen's occasional curious glances toward her, could sense Elena watching the space between herself and Kale with quiet interest, though neither said anything aloud. It was strange, Mira thought, how quickly everything had shifted. Only hours ago, she had been nothing more than an overlooked Omega wandering the mountains alone, invisible even to her own pack. Now she walked beside the Alpha King of the Northern Wolves, a man whose life she had saved without ever knowing what he truly was, and who seemed determined not to let that knowledge change anything between them. She did not know, as they made their way through the snow toward wherever this unexpected journey would lead next, that the true test of everything Kale had just told her was still to come. Days passed slowly inside the cave as the group regained their strength, and with each one, the fragile trust between Mira and the strangers grew a little sturdier. She continued tending to their wounds, foraging quietly for food beyond the ridge whenever the weather allowed, and returning each time with roots, berries, or the occasional small catch that she divided carefully among the group before eating whatever remained. Kale noticed everything. He noticed how she never took the largest portion, how she waited until the others had eaten before touching her own share, how she flinched slightly whenever someone raised their voice too quickly, as though old habits had trained her body to expect harshness even when none was intended. He said nothing about these observations at first, simply filing them away, piecing together a picture of a life that had clearly been far harder than her quiet manner let on. One evening, as the fire crackled low and most of the others had drifted into sleep, Kale found himself sitting near Mira while she mended a torn strip of cloth by the dim orange light. His side had healed enough that movement no longer sent sharp pain through his ribs, though a dull ache remained as a reminder of how close he had come to not surviving at all. You never told me where you come from, he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Mira's hands paused briefly over the fabric before continuing their careful stitching. A village a day's walk from here, she answered. Nothing important. Kale studied her profile in the firelight, the sharp line of her jaw, the tired shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of exhaustion far deeper than a few restless nights could explain. Everything about a person's home matters, he said, even if they believe otherwise. Mira let out a small, humorless laugh, the sound catching slightly in her throat. Not where I come from, she said. There, some things are decided the moment you are born, and nothing you do afterward changes that decision. What do you mean? Kale asked, his voice gentler now, careful not to push too hard against whatever wall she had built around herself. She hesitated, her fingers still incompletely against the cloth. I am an Omega, she finally said, the word falling from her lips like something she had been forced to apologize for 1,000 times before. In my pack, that means I do not matter. It means I eat last, if I eat at all. It means I am given the hardest work and the least respect, and if I disappeared tomorrow, most of them would not even notice. Kale's expression darkened, though not directed at her. Anger flickered behind his eyes, controlled but unmistakable, the same anger she had glimpsed briefly when he first mentioned the ambush that had nearly claimed his life. That rank means nothing to me, he said firmly. I have seen Omegas fight harder and think faster than warriors twice their size. Rank is a title given by people too afraid to look past it. It is not a measure of worth. Mira looked up at him then, surprised by the conviction in his voice. Most people do not believe that, she said quietly. Most people are wrong, Cale replied without hesitation. Something in his tone, steady and certain, settled into her chest in a way she had not expected. She had spent years being told the opposite, hearing it repeated so often that she had almost begun to believe it herself. Yet here was a stranger, a wolf whose life she had saved without knowing anything about him, speaking as though her worth was simply obvious, as though it had never needed proving in the first place. They sat in silence for a while after that, the fire slowly burning down to embers, the others sleeping peacefully around them, safe and warm, because of the girl who had refused to walk away from a sound in the storm. The following morning, Sienna approached Mira while she was gathering firewood near the cave entrance, her steps still slightly unsteady, but growing stronger each day. She helped Mira stack a few branches before speaking, her voice quiet but warm. You should know something, Sienna said carefully. Cale does not open up to strangers easily. He has learned not to over the years. Whatever trust he is showing you, it is not something he gives lightly. Mira glanced toward the cave, where Cale's silhouette could be seen near the fire, speaking quietly with the broad-shouldered man about their route home, once they were strong enough to travel. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because I think you deserve to know it matters, Sienna answered simply, before returning to help gather more wood, leaving Mira with thoughts she was not entirely sure how to untangle. As the days continued, small moments accumulated between Mira and Cale, quiet exchanges that slowly built into something neither of them fully acknowledged out loud. He began asking her opinion on small decisions, deferring to her judgment on matters of health and safety without hesitation. She, in turn, found herself relaxing slightly around him, allowing herself brief moments of honesty she rarely permitted herself around anyone. One afternoon, while checking the wound along his side, Mira noticed how well it had healed, the skin knitting together far faster than she had expected given how deep the injury had been. You heal quickly, she remarked, gently pressing along the edges to check for any remaining tenderness. Cale's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, the first she had seen from him since waking that first morning. I have had practice, he said simply. That should not be something to joke about, Mira said, though a small smile tugged at her own lips despite herself. Perhaps not, Cale agreed, watching her expression with quiet interest. But it is easier to laugh about old wounds than to dwell on how close they came to being the last one. Mira's hand stilled briefly against his side before she continued her work, saying nothing, though the weight of his words settled somewhere deep inside her chest. She had spent so long believing her own life held little value that she had never truly considered how fragile every life could be, how close any single moment could come to being the final one. By the end of the week, most of the group had regained enough strength to move short distances without assistance, though Cale insisted they remain in the cave a few days longer to ensure a full recovery before attempting the journey back toward his own territory. During that time, Mira continued caring for them all, refusing every attempt at repayment, insisting she needed nothing beyond the satisfaction of knowing they would survive. Yet despite her insistence, something had already begun shifting within the group, a quiet recognition that this girl, dismissed by her own pack as worthless, had proven herself more capable, more selfless, and more resilient than anyone among them had ever expected a single stranger to be. And for Cale, watching her move through each day with quiet determination and unwavering kindness, a question had begun forming that he could not quite silence. A question about who this girl truly was beneath the modest way she carried herself, and what kind of world could have looked at someone like her and decided she was worth nothing at all. The journey down from the mountain took most of the day, the group moving slowly to accommodate injuries and lingering exhaustion from the storm. As the terrain leveled out into gentler hills, Mira noticed Cale watching her more closely than before, though he said little, seemingly content to observe rather than question. It was Elena who eventually closed the distance between them, falling into step beside Mira as the group paused near a frozen stream to rest. You handled that well, Elena said quietly, nodding back toward where Cale stood speaking with Owen. Learning who he truly is, I mean. Most people either collapse into groveling or become so nervous they can barely speak a full sentence. I nearly did the first one, Mira admitted with a small, tired laugh. He stopped me before I could fully commit to it. That sounds like him, Elena said, a fond smile touching her lips. Cale has never had much patience for those who treat him differently once they learn his title. He values people who see him honestly, flaws and all, rather than simply bowing to the position he holds. Mira considered this as she watched Kale from across the small clearing, noting the easy way he spoke with Owen, without any of the distant formality she had always associated with authority in her own pack. Has he always been like this? She asked. Even before becoming Alpha King? Elena's expression grew thoughtful, something like sadness passing briefly across her features. He's changed, in some ways. Becoming king young and under difficult circumstances forces a person to grow quickly. But the core of who he is, his sense of fairness, his refusal to accept cruelty toward those weaker than himself, that has never wavered. Difficult circumstances? Elena hesitated, glancing toward Kale as though gauging whether it was her place to share such details. That's a story for him to tell, if he chooses. It's not mine to give away. Mira nodded, understanding the boundary being drawn, though her curiosity about the man who had so thoroughly upended her expectations only grew stronger. They resumed walking not long after, the terrain gradually becoming more familiar to Mira as they approached the edges of her own territory. She recognized the ridgeline in the distance, the particular shape of the hills that marked the boundary of Ashfall Packland. "This is as far as I need to go with you," she said, stopping at the edge of a clearing that marked the informal border between territories. "My pack's lodge is just beyond that ridge." Kale, who had drifted closer during her conversation with Elena, frowned slightly at her words. "You intend to walk the rest of the way alone?" "I've made this walk countless times," Mira said. "I'll be fine." "That wasn't my concern," Kale said, his tone carrying a weight that made Mira pause. "I intend to see you safely return to your pack, and to properly acknowledge what you did for us last night." Mira felt a flicker of unease at that. "That isn't necessary. I didn't help you expecting recognition." "I'm aware of that," Kale said, "which is precisely why you deserve it." Before Mira could argue further, Owen approached, his expression carrying a seriousness that hadn't been present during their earlier conversations. "My lord, before we continue, there's something you should know about the situation at the ravine. When we found the tracks leading up to where you fell, we discovered signs that the ledge above may have been intentionally weakened. It's possible the collapse that sent you and the others into the ravine wasn't purely a result of the storm." Kale's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the warmth Mira had grown accustomed to over the past day replaced by something sharp and calculating. "Explain," he said simply. "The snow above the ravine showed signs of disturbance inconsistent with natural drift patterns," Owen continued. "It's possible someone created the conditions for that collapse deliberately, timing it to coincide with the storm, so any evidence would be buried before it could be properly investigated." Mira listened to this exchange with growing unease, realizing suddenly that the danger surrounding this group extended far beyond the blizzard itself. Kale, sensing her reaction, turned to address her directly. "This doesn't concern you," he said, though his tone had softened again. "You've already done more than enough. There's no need for you to become entangled in matters of pack politics that have nothing to do with you." "I appreciate that," Mira said carefully. "But I already am entangled, whether either of us intended it or not. I found you at that ravine. If someone caused that collapse deliberately, they may not be pleased to learn that all of you survived, or that a witness exists who can testify to finding you there." Kale's expression grew troubled, clearly having already considered this possibility himself. "That is a fair point," he admitted. "Which is precisely why I intend to see you safely returned home, and to ensure your pack understands the significance of what you've done, regardless of any danger that may follow." They continued walking together, the mood among the group noticeably more guarded than before, each member scanning the surrounding landscape with heightened alertness. Mira found herself grateful, despite her earlier insistence that she required no escort, for the presence of experienced warriors as they crossed the remaining distance toward her pack's territory. As the Ashfall Lodge came into view, a large timber structure nestled against the base of the ridge, Mira felt her earlier confidence begin to waver. She had left this place invisible, unnoticed, and now she was returning with the Alpha King of the Northern Wolves and his entire personal guard in tow. "They're going to have questions," she said quietly, more to herself than to Kale. "Good," Kale replied, his tone carrying an edge that suggested he welcomed the prospect of those questions. "I have a few of my own." Before they reached the main gate, a figure emerged from the lodge, moving quickly upon spotting the approaching group. Mira recognized him immediately as Victor, her pack's alpha, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm as he registered exactly who was approaching his territory. "My lord," Victor said, his voice strained as he attempted an appropriately respectful bow, while clearly scrambling to understand the situation. "This is an unexpected honor. To what do we owe this visit?" "Your Omega," Kale said, his tone carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Saved the lives of myself and 6 members of my personal guard during last night's storm." Victor's gaze flickered toward Mira, confusion evident in his expression, as though the concept of her performing any significant act was difficult for him to process. "Mira?" he said, and there was no mistaking the surprise in his voice. She did what exactly?" "She found us buried in a ravine, half frozen, and single-handedly dragged all 6 of us to shelter, where she then kept us alive through the remainder of the storm," Kale said, each word deliberate and measured. "Without her intervention, I have no doubt we would have died before morning." Victor's expression cycled rapidly through disbelief, calculation, and finally something that resembled forced pride, though Mira recognized the falseness of it immediately, having witnessed enough of his genuine reactions over the years to know the difference. "We are, of course, thrilled to hear of her courage," Victor said, attempting a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mira has always shown promise, even if her rank hasn't always reflected her true capabilities." The blatant dishonesty of the statement made Mira's jaw tighten, memories of years spent being dismissed, overlooked, and treated as though her presence within the pack was an inconvenience rather than a contribution flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. Kale's expression remained carefully neutral, though Mira noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze had sharpened at Victor's obvious attempt to reframe the narrative in his own favor. "Is that so?" Kale said, his voice deceptively mild. "Then I imagine you'll have no objection to formally acknowledging her contribution before your entire pack." Victor's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, my lord, whatever you believe is appropriate." "I believe," Kale said, "that would be an excellent place to begin." Mira stood quietly beside the group, watching this exchange unfold with a strange mixture of vindication and apprehension. For years she had accepted her position within the pack without complaint, had convinced herself that her worth was accurately reflected by the treatment she received. Now, standing beside a man who commanded more respect and authority than her own alpha, she found herself wondering, for the first time in longer than she could remember, whether everything she had been taught to believe about her own value had been wrong all along. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that had begun to feel almost peaceful despite the circumstances that had brought them all together. Mira was outside the cave, teaching Sienna how to identify which winter roots were safe to eat, when the broad-shouldered man, whose name she had learned was Derek, called out to Kale from deeper within the cave, his voice carrying easily through the quiet air. "We should send word ahead once we reach the border," Derek said, unaware that Mira stood close enough to hear every word. "Your Highness will want the council informed immediately, given what happened." The words hit Mira like a physical blow. She froze mid-sentence, the root she had been holding slipping from her fingers into the snow. Sienna's eyes widened in alarm as she realized what had just been said, and inside the cave, Derek's expression shifted instantly from casual to horrified as he registered his own mistake. Mira turned slowly toward the cave entrance, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Kale stood near the fire, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture had gone rigid, as though bracing for a reaction he already knew was coming. "Your Highness," Mira repeated quietly, the words tasting strange and heavy on her tongue. She looked between Derek's guilty expression and Kale's carefully controlled face, pieces slowly clicking into place. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair before answering. "My full name is Kale Ashford," he said. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The words seemed to echo through the small cave, growing louder with each passing second of silence that followed. Mira felt the blood drain from her face, her mind racing back through every moment of the past several days, every casual conversation, every instance where she had spoken to him as an equal, given him orders about his own recovery, teased him gently about his injuries. She had been treating the most powerful wolf in the entire Northern Territory as though he were nothing more than an ordinary stranger. "I am so sorry," Mira said quickly, dropping into an immediate bow, her body folding low despite the ache still lingering in her tired muscles. "I did not know. I would never have spoken to you the way I did if I had known who you were. Please forgive me." Kale's expression shifted instantly, something between frustration and disappointment flickering across his features. "Stop that," he said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that made Mira freeze mid-motion. "Rise. Now." She straightened slowly, confusion clear on her face. "I meant no disrespect," she began, but Kale cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "You showed me nothing but respect," he said. "What you are doing right now, bowing and apologizing for something that was never wrong in the first place. That is the disrespect. You saved my life. You saved the lives of every wolf in this cave. That truth does not change simply because you now know my title. But you are the Alpha King, Mira said, her voice trembling slightly. I spoke to you as though we were equals. I gave you orders. I teased you. And every single moment of that was exactly what I needed, Cale said, his voice softening now, though the firmness beneath it remained unshaken. Do you understand how rare it is for someone to treat me as a person rather than a title? Everyone around me chooses their words carefully, watches everything they say, terrified of offending someone with power over their lives. You never did that. You spoke honestly, cared for me because it was the right thing to do, not because you knew who I was or what I could offer you in return. That honesty is worth more to me than every bow and title in this world. Mira stood silently for a long moment, processing his words, her mind still struggling to reconcile the quiet, wounded stranger she had cared for, with the powerful figure Derek's slip had revealed. Around them, the others watched the exchange in careful silence, none of them daring to interrupt. I do not know how to treat you differently now, she admitted finally, her voice quiet and uncertain. Then do not try, Cale said simply. Treat me exactly as you have this past week. That is all I am asking. It felt like an impossible request. Everything Mira had ever been taught about hierarchy, about knowing her place, about the consequences of speaking too freely to those above her, screamed against what he was asking. Yet something in his steady gaze, in the sincerity behind his words, made her believe he truly meant it. Derek, meanwhile, looked thoroughly miserable, clearly aware that his careless slip had disrupted something delicate that had been building over the past several days. I am sorry, my lord, he said quietly. It was not my place to reveal that before you were ready. Cale waved off the apology with a tired gesture. It would have come out eventually, he said. Perhaps it is better this way, before we return and she learns it from someone less careful with their words. The rest of that day passed in an uneasy quiet, Mira moving through her usual tasks with visible hesitation, second-guessing every word before speaking, every gesture before making it. Cale noticed, of course, watching with growing frustration as the natural ease between them, carefully built over days of shared hardship, threatened to crumble beneath the weight of a single revealed title. That evening, once most of the others had settled for the night, Cale approached her quietly near the cave entrance, where she stood staring out at the darkening sky, lost in thought. You are overthinking this, he said gently. Mira turned to face him, exhaustion evident in the tight lines around her eyes. I have spent my entire life learning exactly how to behave around those with power, she said. It is not something I can simply forget because you ask me to. Then do not forget it, Cale replied. Just choose, for once, to set it aside. I am not asking you to disrespect who I am. I am asking you to remember who you were to me before you knew my title, because that person, the one who dragged 7 strangers through a blizzard without a single thought for her own survival, that person is who I want standing beside me, not someone performing careful deference out of fear. Mira studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of insincerity, and finding none. Slowly, carefully, something in her posture began to loosen, the rigid formality softening back into the quiet confidence she had carried throughout their days together. I will try, she said finally. That is all I ask, Cale answered, and for the first time since the truth had emerged, something like a genuine smile crossed his face, small but real, a silent acknowledgement that whatever had begun between them in that cave was worth protecting, regardless of titles, rank, or the weight of who either of them was meant to be. 2 more days passed before Cale declared the group strong enough to begin the journey back toward his territory. The wounds had closed, the fevers had broken, and though exhaustion still lingered in their limbs, every member of the group could now walk unassisted, a fact that still felt like a small miracle to those who remembered how close they had come to not walking at all. As they packed what little they had, preparing to leave the cave that had sheltered them through the worst of the storm, Cale found himself watching Mira closely, noticing the quiet sadness that flickered briefly across her face as she gathered her few belongings. You do not have to return to your pack, he said suddenly, the words surprising even himself as they left his mouth. Mira paused, glancing up at him with confusion. What do you mean? She asked. Cale hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. I mean that you have no obligation to return to a place that has treated you as though you were invisible your entire life. There are other paths available to you now, if you want them. Mira's expression shifted, something complicated passing behind her eyes. It is not that simple, she said quietly. My pack, whatever its faults, is still the only home I have ever known. I do not know if I am ready to walk away from everything familiar, even if that familiarity has never been kind to me. Cale nodded slowly, respecting her hesitation even as something in his chest tightened at the thought of her returning to a place that had caused her so much quiet suffering. Then I will accompany you there first, he said firmly. Before anything else, I want to see this pack for myself. Mira's eyes widened slightly. That is not necessary, she said quickly. You have your own territory to return to, your own responsibilities waiting. Nothing is more important right now than ensuring the person who saved my life, and the lives of my closest companions, is treated with the respect she deserves, Cale replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. We will visit your pack together. After that, whatever you decide, I will support it fully. The others exchanged quiet glances among themselves, though none of them voiced any objection. Sienna, walking slowly beside Derek as they prepared their supplies, offered Mira a small, encouraging smile, one that carried unspoken understanding of exactly what Cale's decision might mean. The journey toward Mira's village took the better part of a day, the group moving slowly to accommodate lingering weakness among the recovering wolves, though their pace quickened as familiar landmarks began appearing along the snow-covered path. Mira's chest tightened with every step closer to home, old anxieties resurfacing despite the quiet strength she had found over the past several days. As the village came into view, smoke rising from familiar chimneys against the pale winter sky, Mira felt Cale's presence beside her shift subtly, his posture straightening, his expression settling into something colder, more commanding, the demeanor of a king preparing to assess a territory not his own. They will not know how to react to you, Mira warned quietly as they approached the outer edge of the village. Good, Cale replied simply, his eyes already scanning the modest wooden structures, the worn paths between homes, searching for anything that might reveal the truth of how this pack had treated the girl walking beside him. The first villager to spot them was an older woman gathering water near the well, who froze mid-motion upon recognizing the unmistakable presence radiating from the strangers approaching her home. Word spread through the village faster than winter wind, and within minutes, faces began appearing in doorways and windows, curious and increasingly nervous as recognition dawned across features that had clearly heard stories of the Alpha King, even if they had never expected to see him standing in their own snow-covered streets. Mira kept her eyes forward, refusing to meet the startled gazes of neighbors who had spent years looking past her as though she did not exist. Beside her, Cale's expression remained carefully neutral, though Mira could sense the tension building within him, a barely restrained anger simmering beneath his composed exterior as he took in every whispered comment, every startled glance directed toward the girl he now recognized as far more valuable than her own pack had ever acknowledged. They approached the largest structure at the center of the village, a modest but sturdy building that served as the home of Mira's pack Alpha, a broad, aging wolf named Garen who emerged from the doorway with visible confusion etched across his weathered face. To what do we owe this unexpected visit? Garen said, his voice carrying forced politeness that did little to mask his obvious nervousness. Cale's gaze swept over him slowly, assessing, before his eyes shifted deliberately toward Mira standing quietly beside him. I believe introductions are unnecessary, given who I am, he said, his tone carrying quiet authority that made Garen's expression falter slightly. What I am curious about is why this young woman, who saved the lives of myself and 6 of my closest companions during the recent storm, appears to hold such little standing within her own pack. Garen's eyes widened in shock, his gaze darting toward Mira as though seeing her for the first time. She saved your life, he said, disbelief coloring his voice. She saved 7 lives, Cale corrected firmly. Without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, despite having every reason to walk past strangers who meant nothing to her. That kind of courage, that kind of selflessness, deserves recognition, not the treatment I have already witnessed simply walking through your village today. A heavy silence settled over the gathering crowd, villagers exchanging uneasy glances, some looking toward Mira with expressions that mixed shame with something almost like disbelief, as though the possibility of her being capable of such an act had never once crossed their minds. Garen cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly struggling to find appropriate words. We were unaware of the full circumstances, he said carefully. If we had known, we would have treated the situation differently. Would you have? Cale asked, his voice sharp enough to make several onlookers flinch. Or would you have continued treating her as though her worth depended entirely on her rank, regardless of what she accomplished? No one answered. The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, broken only by the soft sound of wind moving through the village and the quiet, uneven breathing of a crowd unprepared for the reckoning that had just arrived at their doorstep. Word of the Alpha King's arrival spread through the Ashfall Lodge faster than any storm could have traveled across the mountains. By the time Victor led the group into the Great Hall, nearly the entire pack had gathered, curiosity and nervous energy filling the room with an almost tangible weight. Mira felt every eye in the room shift toward her as she entered alongside Cale and his guard, and she recognized the confusion in those stares immediately. She had spent years being overlooked in this very hall, seated at the edges of gatherings, spoken to only when absolutely necessary. Now she walked through the center of the room, and the sensation of being seen, truly seen, for the first time left her feeling exposed in ways she had not anticipated. A woman near the front of the crowd caught her attention, and Mira felt her stomach tighten. Dara, Victor's second in command, had never bothered to hide her contempt for Omegas, and Mira in particular had borne the brunt of her cruelty more times than she cared to count. "Gather closer," Victor called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of pack leadership, though Mira could hear the underlying tension beneath his words. "We have important matters to address, and an honored guest who has traveled far to speak with us." The crowd shifted, forming a loose circle around the hall, and Cale stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate silence, despite the fact that he had said nothing yet. "2 nights ago," Cale began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "myself and 6 members of my personal guard were caught in a blizzard while traveling through the northern ridge. A collapse sent us into a ravine, where we lay unconscious and freezing, with little chance of surviving until morning." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room before continuing. "We survived that night for one reason only. A young woman from this very pack heard our cries through the storm, found us buried in the snow, and single-handedly dragged all 7 of us, myself included, to shelter. She built a fire, shared what supplies she carried, and stayed awake through the night to ensure none of us succumbed to the cold." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Mira felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward her once more, this time carrying something closer to disbelief than dismissal. "That woman," Cale continued, "is Mira, an Omega of this pack." The murmurs grew louder, and Mira caught sight of Dara's expression twisting into something skeptical, almost offended, as though the very idea of an Omega performing such a feat was an affront to the natural order she believed governed pack hierarchy. "Forgive me, my lord," Dara said, stepping forward with a tone that attempted deference but carried unmistakable condescension beneath it. "But surely there must be some misunderstanding. Mira has never demonstrated any particular strength or capability during her time within this pack. It seems unlikely she could have accomplished what you describe alone." Cale's gaze turned toward Dara, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees despite the fire crackling in the hearth. "Are you suggesting," Cale said, his voice deceptively calm, "that I am mistaken about the circumstances of my own survival?" Dara's confidence visibly wavered under the weight of his stare. "Of course not, my lord. I only meant—" "What you meant," Cale interrupted, "was that your assumptions about this woman's worth, formed without ever witnessing her true capabilities, have blinded you to what she is actually capable of achieving. I would suggest reconsidering those assumptions, given that I am standing before you as living proof of exactly what she accomplished." Dara fell silent, her expression carefully blank, though Mira could see the barely contained resentment simmering beneath the surface. Cale turned his attention back to the gathered pack, his expression hardening further as he continued. "I have spent the past 2 days learning more about how this woman has been treated within her own pack," he said. "I have heard from multiple sources within my own guard who witnessed her interactions with your Alpha and his advisors that her contributions have been consistently dismissed, her presence treated as an afterthought, and her rank used as justification for neglecting even basic care and protection that any pack member deserves." Victor's expression had grown increasingly pale throughout this speech, and he stepped forward hastily, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "My lord, I assure you, any oversight in Mira's treatment was never intentional. We value all members of our pack, regardless of rank." "Do you?" Cale said, cutting him off with a sharpness that left no room for further deflection. "Then perhaps you can explain why an Omega with no family remaining to advocate on her behalf was permitted to wander alone into a mountain storm, without anyone within this pack noticing or caring about her absence. Perhaps you can explain why, when I asked her directly, she informed me that no one would have searched for her had she failed to return." The hall had grown utterly silent now, every member of the pack watching this exchange with a mixture of shock and, in some cases, quiet shame. Victor opened his mouth to respond, but no adequate defense seemed to present itself, and he closed it again, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of Kale's scrutiny. "I am not here to punish your pack," Kale continued, his tone shifting slightly, though the authority behind it remained undiminished. "I am here because a debt exists that must be properly acknowledged. This woman saved my life, and the lives of 6 others who serve me faithfully. That debt will not go unrecognized, regardless of how this pack has chosen to view her in the past." He turned to face Mira directly, and something in his expression softened, the harsh authority giving way to something warmer, more personal. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Mira is under my formal protection. Any harm that comes to her, any mistreatment she suffers at the hands of this pack or any other, will be treated as a direct offense against the Northern Wolves, and will be answered accordingly." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Mira felt her own breath catch in her throat, the weight of his declaration settling over her with a force she had not anticipated. "My lord," Victor said, his voice strained, "surely such a declaration isn't necessary. We are more than capable of properly recognizing Mira's contributions ourselves." "You had years to recognize her contributions," Kale said, cutting him off once more. "You chose not to. That choice has consequences, and this is one of them." Mira stood frozen amid the sudden shift in her circumstances, unable to fully process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Formal protection from the Alpha King of the Northern Wolves was not a small thing, not a symbolic gesture that would fade once he departed. It was a binding declaration that would follow her for the rest of her life, altering her position within pack politics in ways she could barely begin to comprehend. She caught Elena's eye across the hall, and the other woman offered a small, encouraging smile, as though silently confirming that this moment, however overwhelming, was exactly as significant as it felt. "Thank you," Mira said quietly, though her voice carried enough in the silent hall that Kale clearly heard her. "But you didn't need to do all this." "I disagree," Kale said, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a sincerity that made her chest tighten. "You gave without expecting anything in return. The very least I can do is ensure you are never again treated as though you are worth less than you are." The pack remained silent as Kale addressed Victor once more, his tone brooking no argument. "I trust we understand each other regarding Mira's future treatment within this pack." "Perfectly, my lord," Victor said quickly, his earlier bravado entirely gone. Mira stood at the center of a hall that had spent years treating her as invisible, and for the first time, she felt the weight of every eye in the room not as a burden, but as a slow, uncertain dawning of respect that she had never before been permitted to receive. An older man stepped forward from the crowd, his hands trembling slightly as he addressed Kale directly. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn, my lord," he said, "but I believe you should know the full truth of how this pack has treated her." Garen's expression tightened with obvious discomfort, though he said nothing to stop the man from continuing. "Her name is Finian," the older man said, gesturing toward himself. "I knew her parents well before they passed. After they died, this pack decided her Omega status meant she deserved nothing of what other children received. She was given the smallest portion of food, if any remained after others had eaten. She slept in the coldest corner of the communal quarters. When she was old enough to work, she was given tasks meant for 3 people, and treated harshly whenever exhaustion caused her to fall behind." Mira's cheeks flushed with humiliation as every villager present listened to details she had never spoken aloud to anyone, details she had buried deep, telling herself repeatedly that they did not matter, that surviving mattered more than dwelling on old wounds. Finian continued, his voice growing steadier with each word, as though relieved to finally speak a truth he had carried silently for years. She was denied proper healing lessons despite showing remarkable aptitude as a child, simply because the elders decided an Omega had no need for such knowledge. And when illness swept through the pack 3 winters ago, she was the one who cared for the sick in secret, using knowledge she was never meant to have, saving lives that would otherwise have been lost, and she received no acknowledgement for it whatsoever. Kale's expression darkened further with each revelation, his hands clenching slightly at his sides as barely restrained frustration simmered beneath his composed exterior. He turned toward Garen, his voice low and controlled in a way that somehow felt more forceful than shouting would have. "You allowed a child with proven medical knowledge, someone capable of saving lives during an illness outbreak, to be denied training and respect simply because of an arbitrary rank assigned at birth," he said. "And you call yourself a leader capable of guiding this pack." Garen's face paled visibly, his composure crumbling beneath the weight of Kale's words and the growing murmurs of discomfort rippling through his own pack members. many of whom were clearly hearing the full extent of Mira's mistreatment for the first time. "I did not personally oversee every decision regarding her treatment," Garen said weakly, though even he seemed to recognize how hollow the excuse sounded aloud. "That is precisely the problem," Kale replied sharply. "A leader who does not personally ensure every member of their pack is treated with basic dignity has failed at the single most important responsibility of their position." Mira stood frozen throughout the exchange, overwhelmed by hearing her private suffering spoken so openly, so publicly, in front of an entire crowd of familiar faces that had spent years pretending she did not exist. Part of her wanted to disappear, to escape the weight of every eye now turned toward her, filled with expressions she could not quite interpret: guilt, shock, something almost like shame. Yet beneath the discomfort, something else stirred within her chest, something she had not expected to feel. Validation. For years she had wondered whether her own perception of unfair treatment had been exaggerated, whether perhaps she truly did deserve the way she had been treated, whether the voice inside her insisting she mattered was simply naive foolishness. Hearing Finian speak the truth so plainly, hearing Kale's frustration on her behalf, quietly confirmed what she had always suspected but never allowed herself to fully believe. She did not deserve any of it. She never had. Kale turned back toward her then, his expression softening slightly as he took in the overwhelmed look on her face. "You do not have to stay here another moment longer than you wish to," he said quietly, his voice carrying only for her ears despite the crowd surrounding them. "Whatever you decide, I will support it completely." Mira glanced around at the gathered villagers, at Garen's shame-stricken face, at Finian's earnest apologetic expression, at the collective weight of years spent being overlooked and dismissed by people who had never once considered how deeply their casual cruelty had cut. "I do not know what I want yet," she admitted quietly, "but I know I cannot simply return to how things were before." Kale nodded, understanding evident in his gaze. "Then we will figure out what comes next together," he said. Around them, the crowd remained silent, watching a moment none of them had expected to witness. A quiet reckoning arriving on an ordinary winter afternoon, carried in on the shoulders of a king who refused to let injustice pass unspoken. Sienna, standing a short distance away, reached out and gently squeezed Mira's hand, a small gesture of solidarity that meant more to Mira than words could have expressed. Derek and the others watched with quiet approval, their earlier wariness of this village replaced entirely by protective loyalty toward the girl who had saved their lives. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Mira did not feel invisible. She felt seen, truly seen, standing in the very village that had spent years looking straight through her. And though the feeling was strange, unfamiliar, and almost overwhelming, she found she did not want it to end. Kale let the silence stretch a moment longer before he turned fully to face the gathered crowd, his voice rising with the unmistakable weight of formal authority. "Villagers of this pack," he said, "hear me clearly, for I will not repeat myself." Every eye in the crowd fixed on him instantly, even Garen straightening despite the dread evident on his weathered face. "3 nights ago," Kale continued, "my closest companions and I were left for dead in a ravine not far from here, victims of an ambush and a storm that should have ended all 7 of our lives before morning arrived. We were saved by one person, and one person only, a woman your pack has spent years dismissing, underfeeding, and denying even the basic dignity owed to any living creature." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by the sharp look Kale cast across them. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the gathered villagers. "Mira is placed under my direct protection as the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Her rank within this pack, whatever meaningless label you have assigned her, no longer holds any bearing on how she is to be treated. Any mistreatment directed toward her from this day forward, whether by word or by action, will be regarded as a direct offense against my authority, and will be addressed accordingly." Garen bowed low immediately, his voice trembling with poorly concealed fear. "Understood, my lord," he said quickly. "She will be treated with the utmost respect from this moment forward. You have my word." "Your word means little to me, Garen," Kale replied coldly. "What matters is whether your actions finally match it. I will be watching, even from a distance, and I assure you, I will know if anything changes for her once I am gone." The old Alpha nodded quickly, sweat beading at his temple despite the winter chill surrounding them. Kale's gaze then swept across the wider crowd, lingering on faces that had once looked past Mira, as though she were nothing more than shadow and silence. "One of you watched a child lose her parents, and decided her grief was an excuse to abandon her," he said, his voice hardening further. Every one of you watched her serve this pack in ways that went unnoticed and unrewarded, simply because a title convinced you she deserved nothing better. I hope, standing here today, you understand exactly what you nearly lost, and exactly what kind of person you failed to protect. Several villagers lowered their eyes, unable to meet his gaze, shame settling heavily across features that had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of reckoning. Finian stepped forward once more, his voice quieter now, though no less sincere. On behalf of those of us who failed her, I am deeply sorry, he said, turning directly toward Mira. You deserved so much better than what this pack gave you, and I hope, whatever you decide moving forward, that you find the life you have always deserved. Mira's throat tightened with unexpected emotion, the weight of years finally being acknowledged settling over her in a way she had never allowed herself to imagine. Thank you, she said softly, her voice steadier than she expected. Cale turned to her then, his expression softening from the commanding authority he had just displayed into something warmer, something private despite the crowd surrounding them. You do not owe this pack anything further, he said quietly. Not your presence, not your loyalty, not another moment of your time, unless you choose to give it freely. Mira looked around at the village she had grown up in, at faces both familiar and suddenly strange, at a home that had never truly felt like one despite years of trying to make it fit. Something inside her, long buried beneath obligation and fear, finally settled into clarity. I do not wish to stay here, she said, her voice carrying quiet certainty. Not anymore. Cale's expression shifted into something close to relief, though he kept his tone measured, careful not to influence a decision that needed to remain entirely her own. Then you are welcome to travel with us, he said. There is a place for you within my territory, for as long as you wish to stay. Garen, still visibly shaken by the formal decree that had just been issued against his pack, stepped forward hesitantly. If you choose to leave, we will not stop you, he said, and if you ever wish to return, you will find the treatment you deserve waiting for you. Mira studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity behind his carefully chosen words, before offering only a small, non-committal nod. She did not owe him forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but she recognized the fear driving his sudden change in tone, and she allowed herself the small dignity of not responding with anger she did not currently feel. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of disbelief and quiet reflection following them back to their homes, Sienna approached Mira with a warm smile. Welcome to the family, she said gently, whatever that ends up meaning for you. Derek and the others echoed similar sentiments, each expressing genuine gratitude and quiet respect for the woman who had saved their lives and now stood on the edge of an entirely new chapter, one she had never imagined possible for someone born into a rank that promised her nothing. Mira gathered what few belongings remained in her small quarters within the village, the process taking only minutes given how little she had ever truly been allowed to own. As she stepped back outside, ready to leave the only home she had ever known, she felt Cale's presence settle beside her, steady and reassuring. Are you ready? He asked quietly. Mira looked back once more at the village fading behind her, at the life she was leaving without regret, before turning her gaze forward toward whatever awaited her next. Yes, she said simply. I believe I finally am. That evening, after the great hall had emptied and most of the pack had retreated to their own quarters to whisper about everything they had witnessed, Cale found Mira sitting alone near the edge of the frozen stream that ran behind the lodge. I thought I might find you out here, he said, approaching slowly, giving her ample space to acknowledge him before settling onto a nearby rock. You disappeared rather quickly after the announcement. I needed air, Mira admitted. It's a lot to absorb all at once. I imagine it is. He was quiet for a moment, watching the way moonlight caught on the icy surface of the stream. May I ask you something? And you can decline to answer if you'd prefer. You can ask. Owen mentioned that you have no family remaining within this pack. I'd like to understand more about that, if you're willing to share it. Mira drew her knees up toward her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she considered how much of her history she wanted to reveal. There was something about Cale's directness, his willingness to simply ask rather than pry through gossip or assumption, that made the prospect of honesty feel less daunting than it usually did. My parents died when I was young, she said finally. A sickness swept through part of the pack one winter, and they were among those who didn't survive it. I was 7. I'm sorry, Cale said, and the simplicity of the statement, free of pity or performance, made it easier for Mira to continue. After that, I was raised by whoever within the pack was willing to take me in, though no one ever did so out of genuine care. I was passed between a few different households, always treated as an obligation rather than a member of the family. By the time I was old enough to live independently, most of the pack had simply forgotten I existed beyond the occasional task they assigned me. And your rank is Omega, Kale said carefully. Was that determined before your parents passed, or after? After, Mira said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. My mother held a respectable position within the pack. Had she lived, I likely would have inherited a very different standing. But once she was gone, and I had no one to advocate on my behalf, Victor's father, who led the pack at the time, decided it was simpler to classify me as an Omega. It meant fewer resources needed to be allocated toward my upbringing, fewer expectations placed on anyone to properly care for me. Kale's jaw tightened, and Mira could see the barely restrained anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. That is not how Omega status is meant to function, he said. It is not a punishment, nor a convenient label to justify neglect. I know that now, Mira said. But when you're 7 years old and told that your rank has changed, that you're now considered less valuable than the other children around you, you don't have the perspective to question it. You simply accept it as truth, and you spend the rest of your life living according to that belief. And yet you saved my life, Kale said quietly, and the lives of 6 others, not because anyone expected it of you, but because you chose to act despite everything you'd been taught about your own worth. Mira looked over at him, surprised by the intensity in his gaze. I suppose I did. That tells me something important about you, Kale continued. It tells me that whatever this pack tried to convince you of, they failed to break the part of you that matters most, your compassion, your instinct to help those in need, even at cost to yourself. Those qualities cannot be manufactured through rank or training. They exist within a person, or they don't. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier, Mira admitted quietly, if I had simply accepted the coldness this pack showed me, and returned it in kind. It might have hurt less. Perhaps, Kale said, but I don't believe you would have become the person capable of what you did 2 nights ago. Bitterness closes people off. It makes them smaller, more guarded, less willing to extend themselves for others. Whatever pain this pack caused you, it didn't shrink your capacity for kindness. If anything, it seems to have expanded it. Mira considered his words carefully, feeling something shift within her chest, a small crack forming in the armor she had built around herself over years of dismissal and neglect. Can I ask you something now? She said. Of course. Elena mentioned that you became Alpha King under difficult circumstances. She wouldn't elaborate, said it wasn't her story to tell. I don't want to pry if it's something you'd rather not discuss, but I find myself curious. Kale's expression grew distant for a moment, his gaze fixed on the frozen stream, as though searching for the right words among the ice. My father was Alpha King before me, he said finally. He died when I was 17, killed during a conflict with a rival pack that had been encroaching on our territory for years. I was thrust into leadership far younger than I was prepared for, forced to make decisions that affected thousands of lives while still grieving the loss of my own father. That must have been incredibly difficult, Mira said softly. It was. There were advisors within my own pack who believed I was too young, too inexperienced to lead effectively. Some attempted to manipulate my decisions, to position themselves as the true power behind the throne while I served merely as a figurehead. I spent years proving, through action rather than words, that I was capable of ruling in my own right. Is that why you understand what I've experienced? Mira asked. Because you also had to fight against people who underestimated you? Perhaps, Kale said. Though my circumstances were nowhere near as difficult as yours, I at least had the title of Alpha King to lend weight to my voice, even when people doubted my judgment. You've had no such protection, and yet you've maintained a strength of character that many wolves born into far more privileged circumstances never managed to develop. They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the cold night air settling around them, though Mira found she did not mind it as much with Kale's steady presence beside her. There's something else I need to discuss with you, Kale said eventually, his tone shifting into something more serious. Regarding the collapse that sent us into the ravine. Mira turned to look at him fully, sensing the gravity in his voice. Owen mentioned it might not have been accidental. My investigators have continued examining the site since we returned, Kale said. They've found additional evidence suggesting deliberate sabotage. Someone wanted my guard and myself caught in that storm, likely hoping the resulting collapse would either kill us outright or leave us vulnerable enough that the elements would finish the task. Who would want to harm you? Mira asked, though even as she spoke the question, she recognized how naive it sounded given his position. There are always those who covet power, Kale said simply. Rivals within neighboring territories who would benefit from my death, or advisors within my own pack whose ambitions exceed their loyalty. I have suspicions, though nothing concrete enough yet to act upon. And because I found you, because I'm now connected to what happened that night, does that put me in danger as well? Kale's expression grew troubled, and he did not immediately answer, which told Mira more than words could have. It's possible, he admitted finally, which is precisely why I intend to ensure your continued safety, regardless of the political complications that might arise from doing so. Mira absorbed this information carefully, aware that her life had shifted dramatically over the past few days, moving from complete anonymity within her own pack to potential entanglement in dangerous political conflicts she barely understood. I don't regret helping you, she said finally. Whatever comes next because of it. Kale turned to look at her then, something warm and genuine passing across his features. I'm glad to hear that, because I don't intend to let anything happen to you, regardless of what threats emerge from this situation. The moon continued its slow arc across the night sky as they sat together beside the frozen stream, two people from entirely different worlds who had been drawn together by chance and circumstance, neither of them yet aware of how deeply their futures had already become intertwined. The journey toward Kale's territory took 2 full days, winding through valleys and forests Mira had never seen before, landscapes far grander than anything her small village had ever offered. As they crossed a wide ridge overlooking a sprawling settlement nestled between mountains, Mira slowed her steps, taking in the sight before her with quiet awe. Sturdy stone buildings lined wide, organized streets, smoke curling peacefully from dozens of chimneys, and at the center of it all stood a grand structure built from pale stone, its towers rising higher than any building Mira had ever imagined standing in person. Guards patrolled the outer walls with disciplined precision, and villagers moved about their daily business with an ease and confidence that spoke of genuine safety and stability. This is your home, Mira said quietly, more statement than question. For now, Kale replied, glancing at her with a small, unreadable smile. Perhaps yours as well if you wish it. As they descended toward the settlement, word of their arrival spread quickly, and by the time they reached the main gates, a small crowd had gathered, relief and celebration evident on every face at the sight of their Alpha King returning alive alongside his closest companions, all of whom had been feared lost during the storm. Amid the joyful chaos, questions quickly turned toward the quiet stranger walking beside their king, and Kale wasted no time addressing the curiosity directly. This is Mira, he announced to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. She saved my life, along with the lives of everyone traveling with me. Without her courage and skill, none of us would have survived that storm. She is to be treated with the same respect and honor given to any member of this territory, and I expect nothing less from every one of you. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, gratitude and admiration replacing any initial confusion, as villagers stepped forward to offer their thanks directly to Mira, some even bowing slightly despite her visible discomfort at the attention. Later that evening, once the celebration had quieted and most of the household had retired for the night, Kale found Mira standing alone on a balcony overlooking the sleeping settlement below, moonlight casting soft silver light across her thoughtful expression. You seem overwhelmed, he observed gently, joining her at the railing. It is a lot to take in, Mira admitted. A week ago, I was gathering herbs in a storm that no one expected me to survive. Now I am standing in a castle, being thanked by strangers who have never even met me. Kale studied her profile in the moonlight, something warm and careful in his expression. I want to offer you something, he said, not out of obligation, and not simply as repayment for saving my life. I want you to have a permanent place here, within my household, with a rank and title that reflects who you truly are, not who your birth pact decided you should be. Mira turned to face him fully, surprise evident in her expression. What kind of place? She asked carefully. Head healer of this territory, Kale answered without hesitation. I have seen your knowledge, your instincts, your dedication firsthand. My current healers are skilled, but none possess the depth of care you demonstrated in that cave. The position comes with proper training, resources you were always denied, and the respect such knowledge deserves. Mira's breath caught slightly, the weight of the offer settling over her with unexpected intensity. I do not know if I am ready for something like that, she admitted quietly. My entire life, I have been told I am not worthy of such positions. Kale's expression softened further, though his voice remained firm. That is exactly why I am offering it to you, he said, not despite what you were told, but because everything you were told was wrong. You have already proven, beyond any doubt, that you possess exactly the skill and character such a position requires. Mira looked out over the settlement below, lights flickering softly and windows scattered across the peaceful landscape, and felt something shift within her chest, a quiet, growing sense of possibility she had never allowed herself to imagine before. "I would like to try," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. Cale's expression brightened with genuine warmth, something close to relief evident in his posture. "Then it is settled," he said. "Tomorrow, I will introduce you formally to the household, and we will begin arranging proper training under our most experienced healers." "Thank you," Mira said softly, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of everything he had offered her. A home, a purpose, a recognition of worth she had spent her entire life being denied. "You do not need to thank me," Cale replied. "You have already given more to this territory than most could offer in a lifetime. This is simply the beginning of what you deserve in return." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the peaceful settlement below, both aware that something significant had shifted between them over the past several days, though neither yet spoke the words that would give that shift its true name. 3 days after Cale's declaration in the Great Hall, Mira was summoned to the edge of Ashfall territory, where a small envoy from the Northern Wolves waited to escort her to Cale's own lands. The formal protection he had announced required her to spend time within his pack, learning the customs and expectations that came with her new status, and Mira found herself both nervous and strangely eager for the change. The journey to Cale's territory took the better part of a day, winding through forested valleys that grew increasingly unfamiliar the farther they traveled from everything Mira had ever known. Owen led the small group, occasionally glancing back to check on her progress, though his expression remained tense throughout most of the journey. "Is something wrong?" Mira finally asked, noticing his continued vigilance. "We've had reports of unusual activity along this route," Owen admitted. "Given everything that happened during the storm, Cale has asked us to remain alert until we reach the safety of our own territory." Mira's stomach tightened at this information, though she said nothing further, trusting that Owen and the others accompanying her possessed far more experience navigating potential threats than she did. They were perhaps an hour from Cale's lodge when the attack came. It happened swiftly, without warning, 3 figures emerging from dense tree cover along the path, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic ambush. Owen shouted a warning, positioning himself between Mira and the approaching threat while the 2 other guards fanned out to intercept. "Get behind me," Owen ordered, his voice sharp with urgency, and Mira scrambled to comply, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the confrontation unfold. The attackers moved with clear purpose, and though Mira could not follow the details of the confrontation with any real understanding, she recognized immediately that this was no random encounter. These wolves had been waiting, positioned specifically along this path, as though they had known exactly when and where the group would pass. One of the guards accompanying Owen fell back, clutching his arm, and Mira felt panic rising in her throat. "We need to move," Owen said urgently, grabbing Mira's arm and pulling her away from the confrontation, angling toward a narrow break in the tree line. "This way, quickly." They ran, Mira's lungs burning with the effort of keeping pace, branches whipping against her face as Owen navigated the unfamiliar terrain with practiced efficiency. Behind them, she could hear sounds of continued struggle, though she forced herself not to look back, trusting that the remaining guards could handle whatever pursuit followed. "Who were they?" Mira gasped out as they finally slowed near a rocky outcropping that offered some measure of shelter. "I don't know," Owen admitted, his own breathing labored, "but their timing wasn't coincidental. Someone knew you would be traveling this path today, and someone wanted to prevent you from reaching Cale's territory." The implications settled over Mira with cold clarity. Whatever conspiracy had led to the collapse that nearly killed Cale and his guard during the storm, it clearly extended further than a single incident. Someone considered her enough of a threat, or a valuable enough target, to organize a deliberate ambush. "We need to get word to Cale," Owen continued, scanning their surroundings with careful attention. "But we can't risk moving in the open until we're certain the immediate threat has passed." They waited in tense silence, Mira's heart still pounding as she strained to hear any sound that might indicate approaching danger. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity before finally, the crunch of familiar footsteps approached, and one of the guards who had remained behind emerged from the tree line, bearing several minor injuries but otherwise intact. "The attackers retreated once they realized we outnumbered them," the guard reported, his breathing still uneven from the encounter. "But we managed to capture one of them, before the others fled." "Bring him," Owen said immediately. "Cale will want answers, and quickly." They made their way to Kale's lodge with considerably more caution than before, Mira's nerves still frayed from the encounter, her mind racing through implications she barely understood. By the time they arrived, word of the ambush had somehow already reached Kale, and he met them at the entrance with an expression of barely contained fury. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping over Mira with obvious concern before she could even offer a greeting. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Owen got me clear before things escalated too far." Kale's attention shifted to Owen, his expression darkening further. "Report." Owen relayed the details of the ambush efficiently, describing the coordinated nature of the attack, the clear premeditation involved, and the captive they had managed to secure. Kale listened with an intensity that made the surrounding air feel charged with tension, his jaw tightening progressively as the account continued. "Bring the prisoner to the interrogation chamber," Kale said finally. "I want answers before nightfall." "My lord," Owen said carefully. "Given the circumstances, perhaps it would be wise for Mira to remain somewhere secure while we handle this." "No," Mira said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. "This concerns me directly. I want to understand what's happening." Kale studied her for a moment, something like respect flickering behind his gray eyes despite the tension of the situation. "Very well. But you'll remain close to me throughout." The interrogation chamber, situated deep within the lodge, felt cold and imposing despite the warmth radiating from a small fire burning in one corner. The captured attacker, a wiry man with sharp, calculating eyes, sat bound and silent as Kale entered, Mira following a step behind him. "You have two choices," Kale said without preamble, his voice carrying a quiet menace that Mira had not heard from him before. "You can tell me who ordered this attack, or you can remain silent and face the full consequences of attempting to harm someone under my direct protection." The man's expression remained defiant for several long moments before something in Kale's unwavering stare seemed to break through his resolve. "I don't know his name," the man said finally, his voice rough. "We were contacted through an intermediary, paid handsomely to intercept the Omega before she reached your territory." "Why?" Kale demanded. "What value does she hold to whoever hired you?" "I don't know the full reasoning," the man admitted. "Only that our employer seemed convinced that keeping her away from you was worth considerable expense. There was talk of a connection to the collapse at the ravine, though I wasn't given specifics." Kale's expression grew thunderous, and Mira felt a chill settle over her despite the fire crackling nearby. "Someone believes I possess information that threatens them," she said slowly, piecing together the implications. "Something related to what happened during the storm." "It would seem so," Kale said grimly. "Which means whoever orchestrated that collapse is still active, still willing to eliminate any perceived threat to their plans." The captured man offered little additional information despite continued questioning, insisting he had no further knowledge of his employer's identity or motivations. Eventually, Kale ordered him removed to secure holding, his expression remaining troubled long after the man had been led away. "This changes things," Kale said quietly, once he and Mira were finally alone in the chamber. "Whoever is responsible for this clearly views you as a genuine threat, not merely an inconvenient witness." "What could I possibly know that would be worth all this effort?" Mira asked, genuinely bewildered by the situation she now found herself entangled within. "I don't know," Kale admitted, "but we need to find out, before whoever is responsible decides a more direct approach is necessary." Mira felt the weight of the danger settling over her, the realization that her simple act of kindness during a blizzard had somehow drawn her into a conspiracy far larger and more dangerous than she could have ever anticipated. And yet, standing beside Kale in that cold chamber, she found herself feeling something unexpected amid the fear. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone was determined to protect her, regardless of the cost involved. The weeks that followed brought changes to Mira's life that she still sometimes struggled to believe were real. Each morning, she rose to formal training under the territory's most experienced healers, absorbing knowledge she had once been denied with an eagerness that impressed even the most seasoned among them. Her natural aptitude, evident even in that freezing cave, blossomed further under proper guidance, and within a short time, she had already begun assisting with cases that would have overwhelmed a less capable student. Sienna, who had quickly become a close friend, often accompanied her during breaks between lessons, the two of them sharing meals and quiet conversation that Mira found herself treasuring more than she expected. For the first time in her life, she experienced friendship without conditions, without the constant awareness of rank and status dictating every interaction. "You seem different lately," Sienna observed one afternoon as they walked through the castle gardens. snow still clinging to the hedges despite the gradual arrival of milder weather. Different how? Mira asked, genuinely curious. Lighter, Sienna said simply. Like you are finally allowing yourself to exist without constantly bracing for something bad to happen. Mira considered the observation carefully, surprised by how accurate it felt. I suppose I am, she admitted. It is strange, learning to trust that kindness is not always hiding some hidden cost. Sienna smiled warmly. It certainly helps that our king seems rather invested in your happiness, she added, a teasing note entering her voice. Mira felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she said nothing in response, choosing instead to focus intently on a particularly interesting patch of frost-covered flowers nearby. Indeed, Cale's attention toward her had grown increasingly evident over the passing weeks, though neither of them had yet acknowledged it directly. He made a habit of visiting the healing quarters during her training sessions, ostensibly to check on the recovery of his companions, though his conversations often lingered far longer with Mira than strictly necessary. He asked about her progress with genuine interest, celebrated her small victories with quiet pride, and made certain, without ever stating it outright, that she never felt anything less than fully respected within his household. One particularly difficult evening, after Mira had spent hours assisting with a complicated case involving a young guard injured during routine training, she found herself utterly exhausted, seeking quiet solitude in the same balcony where Cale had first offered her a place within his territory. He found her there within the hour, drawn by instinct or perhaps simple habit toward wherever she happened to be. Rough day, he observed gently, joining her at the railing. The guard will recover fully, Mira said, exhaustion evident in her voice. But it was closer than I would have liked. You saved him, Cale said firmly. That is what matters. Mira nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in her expression. Sometimes I worry I am not prepared enough for this responsibility, she admitted quietly. What if one day my knowledge is not enough? Cale turned to face her fully, his expression serious and warm at once. Every healer carries that fear, he said. It means you care deeply about the lives entrusted to you. But I have watched you these past weeks, Mira. Your instincts, your dedication, your willingness to learn everything you were once denied, all of it tells me you are exactly where you are meant to be. Mira looked up at him, something soft and vulnerable in her expression. Thank you for believing in me, she said quietly. Even before I fully believed in myself. I will always believe in you, Cale said, his voice carrying quiet conviction that settled deep into her chest. They stood together in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging gently between them, neither quite ready to name what had grown steadily over the weeks since that first freezing night in the cave. As spring slowly began replacing the last remnants of winter, Mira found herself fully settled into her new life, her confidence growing alongside her skills, her friendships deepening, her sense of belonging finally taking root in a way she had never experienced before. The territory that had once been entirely foreign to her now felt increasingly like home, filled with people who valued her not for her rank, but for exactly who she was. And through it all, Cale remained a constant, steady presence beside her, his respect for her never wavering, his patience never faltering, his quiet affection growing more evident with each passing day, until even Mira, despite years of guarding her heart against disappointment, could no longer deny the warmth that filled her chest whenever he was near. The first true warmth of spring arrived on a clear evening when Cale requested Mira join him for a quiet walk through the castle grounds, away from the usual bustle of daily duties. She agreed without hesitation, having grown accustomed to these peaceful moments they had begun sharing more frequently as the weeks progressed. They walked in comfortable silence at first, following a familiar path through the gardens toward a small clearing overlooking the valley below, where the last light of sunset painted the sky in soft shades of orange and gold. I have something I need to tell you, Cale said finally, stopping at the edge of the clearing, his expression more serious than she had seen in some time. Mira turned to face him fully, concern flickering across her features. Is something wrong? She asked. Not wrong, Cale said quickly, though uncertainty colored his voice in a way that felt unfamiliar coming from someone usually so composed. Simply something I have known for a while now, something I was not certain how to explain until I understood it fully myself. Mira waited patiently, sensing the weight behind his hesitation. Among our kind, Cale continued, there exists a bond between certain individuals, a connection deeper than simple attraction or affection. It is rare, and it cannot be forced or chosen. It simply exists. Recognize the moment two people who are meant for each other finally cross paths. Mira's heart began to race, though she remained quiet, allowing him to continue. I felt it the moment I first woke in that cave and saw you kneeling beside me, Kale said, his voice growing steadier with each word. I did not understand it then, not fully, but something inside me recognized you immediately, something that went far beyond simple gratitude for saving my life. Over these past months, watching you grow, watching you heal not just others but yourself, that recognition has only grown stronger. Mira felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity radiating from every word he spoke. Are you saying, she began softly, unable to finish the question. I am saying you are my fated mate, Kale finished gently, closing the remaining distance between them. I have known for some time now, and I have waited to tell you until I was certain you felt safe enough here, secure enough in your own worth, to hear these words without doubting whether you deserved them. Mira's breath caught, emotion overwhelming her as years of feeling unworthy collided directly against the certainty in his voice. I do not know what to say, she whispered. You do not need to say anything you are not ready to say, Kale replied softly. I am not asking for an answer tonight. I simply needed you to know the truth, so that whatever happens next between us, happens with full honesty. Nothing hidden, nothing assumed. Mira looked up at him, moonlight beginning to replace the fading sunset, illuminating the sincerity etched across his features. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and took his hand, something she had never allowed herself to do before, uncertain until this moment whether such closeness was something she was permitted to want. I think, she said quietly, I have felt something similar for a while now. I was simply too afraid to trust it, too afraid that wanting something this good meant it would eventually be taken away. Kale's expression softened further, his hand tightening gently around hers. Nothing about this will be taken away, he said firmly. Not from you, not ever again. Mira felt something inside her finally settle completely, years of guardedness slowly melting away beneath the warmth of his certainty. I want to try, she said softly. I want to see where this leads, together. That is all I could ever ask for, Kale replied, his smile widening into something genuinely joyful, unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him before. News of their bond spread quickly through the territory over the following days, met with widespread celebration rather than surprise, given how evident the connection between them had become to everyone around them. Sienna could hardly contain her excitement, embracing Mira warmly the moment she heard, while Derek and the others offered heartfelt congratulations, genuinely thrilled to see their king finally finding happiness alongside someone who had already proven her devotion beyond any doubt. Weeks later, during a formal gathering held within the great hall of the castle, Kale stood before his assembled territory and made a declaration that would echo through the northern lands for years to come. This woman, he announced, gesturing toward Mira standing proudly beside him, was once told by her own pack that she was worth nothing, simply because of a rank assigned to her at birth. That same woman saved my life, and the lives of everyone I hold dear, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. She has since proven herself not only as a healer of remarkable skill, but as my fated mate, and soon, as Luna of this territory, ruling beside me as an equal in every sense of the word. The hall erupted in cheers, genuine warmth and celebration filling every corner of the grand room, as villagers who had grown to respect and admire Mira over the past months welcomed the announcement with open hearts. Standing beside Kale, surrounded by genuine warmth and acceptance she had once believed impossible, Mira felt the final remnants of old wounds begin to heal completely. She had spent her entire life being told her worth depended entirely on a title she never chose, a rank that promised her nothing but scraps and silence. Yet here she stood, having proven through simple, selfless courage that true strength was never measured by rank or title, but by the size of one's heart, and the willingness to help others even when no one expected anything from you in return. As Kale took her hand before the entire gathered territory, sealing their bond with a promise that would carry them through every season yet to come, Mira understood, finally and completely, that the Omega everyone had once dismissed as worthless had not simply saved a king. She had found, in that freezing storm, exactly where she was always meant to belong. The following days passed in a state of careful vigilance, Kale assigning additional guards to accompany Mira wherever she moved within the lodge, while his investigators worked tirelessly to uncover the identity of whoever had orchestrated both the ravine collapse and the subsequent ambush. Mira spent much of this time with Elena, who had taken it upon herself to help Mira adjust to the unfamiliar rhythms of life within Kale's territory. Despite the underlying tension surrounding the ongoing investigation, Mira found herself grateful for Elena's easy companionship, a welcome contrast to the isolation she had grown accustomed to within her own pack. "You seem distracted," Elena observed one afternoon, as the two of them sat together near the lodge's main hearth, mending torn cloaks that had been damaged during recent patrols. "I keep thinking about what that man said," Mira admitted, "about someone believing I hold information dangerous enough to warrant an ambush. I've spent my entire life being overlooked, invisible. Now suddenly I'm important enough that someone wants me eliminated." "It's not really about you specifically," Elena said gently. "It's about what you witnessed, and what you represent, now that Kale has placed you under his protection. Whoever is behind this likely fears that your continued survival, and your growing closeness to Kale, threatens whatever plans they've been working toward." "Do you have any idea who it might be?" Mira asked. Elena's expression grew thoughtful, though she chose her words carefully. "There have been whispers, nothing concrete, about certain members of Kale's council who resent how quickly he consolidated power after his father's death. Some believe they should have held greater influence during his early years as Alpha King, and have never fully accepted his independence from their guidance." Before Mira could ask further questions, Owen appeared at the entrance to the hearth room, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately drew both women's attention. "Kale needs you both in the council chamber," he said. "The investigation has produced results." They followed Owen through the winding corridors of the lodge, arriving at a chamber where Kale already stood alongside several members of his council, their expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed apprehension. Mira recognized immediately that something significant was about to unfold. "Thank you all for gathering quickly," Kale said, his voice carrying the same measured authority Mira had witnessed during the confrontation in her own pack's hall. "My investigators have uncovered conclusive evidence regarding both the ravine collapse and the subsequent attack on Mira's escort." The room fell silent, tension coiling through the air as every gaze shifted between Kale and the assembled council members. "The evidence points to deliberate sabotage orchestrated from within our own ranks," Kale continued. "Specifically, financial records tracing payments to the mercenaries responsible for the ambush lead directly back to a member of this very council." Mira watched as several council members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly attempting to determine who among them stood accused. A man near the back of the chamber, older than most present, shifted almost imperceptibly, though Mira noticed Kale's gaze fix on him with unwavering focus. "Callum," Kale said, addressing the man directly, "would you care to explain the payments traced to your personal accounts?" The room's attention snapped toward Callum, whose composed expression faltered for just a moment before he attempted to recover. "My lord, I don't know what evidence you believe you've uncovered, but I assure you, any transactions from my accounts have entirely legitimate explanations." "Then explain them," Kale said simply. Callum's hesitation stretched long enough that the silence itself became a form of confession. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, the careful mask of innocence slipping away to reveal something colder underneath. "You were never meant to survive that storm," Callum said, his voice carrying a bitterness that had clearly been simmering for years. "I served your father for decades, guided his decisions, shaped policies that strengthened this pack long before you were even born. When he died, I expected to continue that guidance during your transition into leadership. Instead, you dismissed my counsel at every turn, surrounded yourself with advisors who told you only what you wanted to hear. So you decided the solution was to have me killed," Kale said, his voice deadly quiet. "I decided the solution was to ensure this pack received leadership that respected the wisdom of those who built its foundations," Callum said, his composure fully abandoned now. "Your death during that storm would have created an opportunity for proper guidance to be restored, rather than continuing under your reckless independence." "And the Omega," Kale said, gesturing toward Mira. "What threat did she pose to your plans?" "She ruined everything," Callum spat, his gaze shifting toward Mira with open resentment. "If she had simply walked past that ravine, as any sensible person would have during such dangerous conditions, you and your entire guard would have perished exactly as intended. Instead, her interference preserved you, and her continued presence within your protection threatens to expose the full scope of my involvement, should she ever recall details from that night that implicate me further." The room erupted into murmurs, several council members visibly recoiling from Callum's admission, their expressions carrying genuine shock at the betrayal unfolding before them. "Guards," Kale said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the visible tension in his frame. "Take him into custody. He will face full judgment for treason and attempted assassination of his Alpha King." As guards moved to restrain Callum, the older man's expression twisted into something desperate. his final words carrying across the chamber as he was led away. "You will regret dismissing those who built this pack's strength long before your reign began," he called out. "History will remember your arrogance, even if you silence me now." Chaol watched him go without responding, his expression carefully controlled despite the obvious weight of the betrayal he had just witnessed from someone who had served his own father for decades. Once the chamber had cleared of guards and prisoner alike, Chaol turned to address the remaining council members, his voice carrying renewed authority. "Let this serve as a clear reminder to everyone present," he said. "Loyalty to this pack means loyalty to its people, not merely to positions of comfort or influence held by any single individual. I will not tolerate treachery, regardless of how long someone has served, or how deeply entrenched their resentments may run." The council members nodded, several offering renewed pledges of loyalty, though Mira noticed the lingering unease that permeated the room, the realization that betrayal could emerge from even the most trusted corners of leadership. Later that evening, once the chamber had emptied entirely, Chaol found Mira standing near a window overlooking the moonlit grounds of the lodge, her expression thoughtful. "It's over now," he said, approaching quietly. "The threat against you has been resolved." "I keep thinking about what he said," Mira admitted, "about regretting your decisions. Do you think he was right, that dismissing his council was a mistake?" Chaol considered this for a moment before answering. "I think there is wisdom in honoring those who came before, in learning from experience rather than dismissing it outright. But there is also danger in allowing loyalty to tradition to override the need for growth, for new perspectives that better serve the people we're meant to protect." Callum wanted control, not merely respect. "Those are different things entirely." Mira nodded, understanding settling over her as she considered the parallel between Callum's resentment and her own experience within her former pack, both situations rooted in a refusal to see value beyond rigid, predetermined hierarchies. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing I was worth protecting, even when doing so put you at odds with someone who had served your family for decades." Chaol turned to face her fully, something warm and unguarded passing across his expression in the soft moonlight filtering through the window. "You were never a difficult choice to protect," he said simply. "You've been the easiest decision I've made since becoming Alpha King." The words settled between them with a weight that neither seemed inclined to break, the tension of the past several days finally giving way to something quieter, something that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of genuine safety rather than merely the absence of immediate danger. With the immediate danger resolved, life within Chaol's territory settled into a rhythm that Mira found herself slowly adjusting to, though the transition remained far from seamless. The formal protection Chaol had declared meant she now held a recognized place within his pack's structure, yet she still struggled with the instinct to shrink herself, to assume she belonged at the margins rather than anywhere near the center of important gatherings. "You're doing it again," Elena said one morning, catching Mira hovering near the back wall of the dining hall rather than joining the others at the main table. "Doing what?" Mira asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Making yourself small," Elena said gently. "You don't need to do that here. No one is going to dismiss you for taking a seat at the table." Mira offered a small, embarrassed smile, acknowledging the truth in Elena's observation, before allowing herself to be led toward the main gathering, where several members of Chaol's guard greeted her with easy familiarity that still felt foreign after years of being overlooked. Chaol himself arrived shortly after, taking his customary seat at the head of the table, though his gaze found Mira almost immediately, a small, genuine smile touching his lips as their eyes met. "I have news," he announced to the gathered group, though his attention remained partially fixed on Mira, even as he addressed the wider table. "The council has unanimously agreed to formally recognize Mira's position within our pack, beyond the temporary protection I initially declared." Mira blinked, uncertain what this meant exactly, though the murmurs of approval from around the table suggested it carried significant weight. "What position?" she asked carefully. "Given your demonstrated courage, your resourcefulness, and your evident capacity for leadership under pressure," Chaol said, "the council has proposed granting you the rank of Honored Protector, a position traditionally reserved for those who have performed acts of extraordinary service to this pack. It carries privileges equivalent to those held by senior guard members, along with a permanent place within our territory, should you choose to accept it." The offer settled over Mira with a weight she struggled to fully process. After years of being classified as an Omega, of having her worth determined by a label assigned to her as a child without her consent or input, the prospect of an entirely new rank, one earned through her own actions rather than inherited circumstance, felt almost impossible to believe. "Why?" she asked quietly. Why would your council agree to such a thing for someone who isn't even originally from this pack? Because you saved 7 lives without hesitation, expecting nothing in return, Kale said. Because you've demonstrated, repeatedly, a character that many wolves born into far higher status fail to embody. Rank should reflect who a person truly is, not merely the circumstances of their birth. Around the table, several guards nodded in agreement, their expressions carrying genuine warmth rather than the grudging tolerance Mira had grown accustomed to receiving throughout her life. I don't know what to say, she admitted. You don't need to decide immediately, Kale said. Take whatever time you need to consider what you want. Over the following days, Mira found herself walking the grounds of Kale's territory frequently, turning the offer over in her mind, while gradually growing more familiar with the customs and people that made up this unfamiliar but increasingly welcoming community. She spoke with Finn, who had fully recovered from the ordeal in the storm, and now treated her with the easy camaraderie of someone who considered her a genuine friend rather than merely a curiosity. She spent afternoons with Elena, learning the history and traditions of the Northern Wolves, absorbing knowledge that had never been available to her within her own isolated existence at Ashfall. And she spent evenings with Kale, conversations that stretched long into the night, covering everything from pack politics to childhood memories, to the quiet dreams each of them had never voiced aloud to anyone else. I never expected this, Mira admitted one evening, as they sat together near the same frozen stream where they had first spoken honestly about her past. Any of it. I thought I would spend my entire life exactly as I had for years, invisible, overlooked, accepting whatever scraps of consideration anyone bothered to offer. And now, Kale asked, now I'm being offered a rank I never thought possible, in a pack that barely knew I existed a few weeks ago. It's overwhelming, in the best possible way. You've earned every bit of it, Kale said. Nothing about this offer is charity, Mira. It's recognition, long overdue, of exactly who you've always been. Mira considered his words, feeling something settle within her chest, a quiet confidence that had never quite existed before, not in all her years navigating the careful diminishment forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. I accept, she said finally, the position, the rank, all of it. I want to build a life here, among people who see me clearly rather than through the lens of a label I never chose. Kale's expression brightened with genuine pleasure at her decision, though something else lingered beneath the surface, something Mira had noticed growing between them over the past several weeks, but had not yet found the courage to address directly. There's something else, Kale said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that felt unfamiliar coming from someone typically so composed and confident. Something I've wanted to discuss, though I wasn't certain how to broach the subject given everything else you've been navigating. What is it? Mira asked, her heart beginning to quicken slightly at the shift in his tone. Since the night of the storm, Kale said carefully, I've felt something I haven't experienced before, not with the same intensity. A connection that feels different from ordinary friendship or gratitude. I wasn't certain, at first, whether it stemmed simply from the circumstances of how we met, from the debt I felt toward you for saving my life, but the longer I've known you, the clearer it's become that what I feel extends well beyond simple gratitude. Mira felt her breath catch, uncertain how to respond, though something within her recognized the truth of his words, mirrored in feelings she had been reluctant to examine too closely within herself. I felt it too, she admitted quietly. Something I couldn't quite explain, given everything else happening around us. I told myself it was simply the intensity of the circumstances, the strangeness of everything that's unfolded since that night in the storm. And now? Kale asked, echoing her earlier question back to her. Now, Mira said, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not certain that explanation accounts for everything I feel. They sat together in the quiet evening air, the space between them charged with unspoken possibility, neither quite ready to name fully what was growing between them, yet both increasingly aware that whatever connection had formed since that fateful night in the storm was becoming something neither of them could easily dismiss or ignore. Weeks passed, and Mira settled fully into her new role within Kale's territory, the honored protector rank granting her responsibilities that continually surprised her with how naturally she rose to meet them. She oversaw the training of younger pack members alongside Owen, contributed to council discussions regarding territory management, and found herself, for the first time in her life, genuinely respected by those around her, rather than merely tolerated. Yet through all of this progress, the unspoken connection between herself and Kale continued to grow, neither of them quite ready to voice fully what had become increasingly obvious to everyone else within the pack. You two are ridiculous, Elena said one afternoon, finding Mira in the training yard, watching Kale instruct a group of younger guards with focused intensity. Everyone can see it, except apparently the both of you. See what? Mira asked, though the flush creeping up her neck likely gave away her true understanding of Elena's meaning. The way you look at him, the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is paying attention. Finn has taken to wagering with the other guards on how much longer it will take before one of you finally acknowledges what's obviously happening. Mira laughed despite herself, though the observation left her feeling both embarrassed and strangely hopeful. It's complicated, she said. There's still so much uncertainty about what any of this means, given his position, given everything that's happened. Some things aren't as complicated as we make them, Elena said gently. Sometimes the simplest explanation is also the truest one. That evening, Kale requested Mira's presence in the private garden situated behind the main lodge, a space Mira had visited only rarely, understanding it to hold particular significance within Kale's own history. Elena had once mentioned that his mother had cultivated the garden before her own passing years earlier, and that Kale rarely invited others into that quiet, personal space. She found him standing near a small stone fountain, moonlight casting soft silver light across the carefully tended plants surrounding them. You wanted to see me, Mira said, approaching slowly. I did, Kale said, turning to face her fully. There's something I need to tell you, something I've been avoiding out of uncertainty regarding how you might receive it. Mira's heart quickened at the seriousness in his tone, though something in his expression suggested nervousness rather than concern. You can tell me anything, she said softly. Kale took a breath, seeming to gather his resolve before continuing. Wolves like ourselves sometimes experience a connection that goes beyond ordinary attraction or friendship, a bond that marks two people as fated for one another, recognized through an unmistakable pull that intensifies the longer two people spend in each other's presence. A mate bond, Mira said quietly, understanding immediately what he was describing, though the reality of him speaking these words directly to her left her feeling breathless. Yes, Kale confirmed. I've felt it since that first night in the cave, though I told myself initially it was simply gratitude, or the intensity of shared danger creating false intimacy. But the feeling has only grown stronger with each passing week, each conversation, each moment spent in your presence. I no longer believe it can be explained away as anything other than what it truly is. Mira felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the vulnerability in his admission, by the genuine uncertainty evident in his expression despite his usual composed authority. I've felt it too, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I told myself the same things, that it was simply the strangeness of our circumstances, the intensity of everything that's happened since that storm. But it's more than that, isn't it? I believe it is, Kale said, closing the remaining distance between them, his gray eyes searching hers with a mixture of hope and lingering uncertainty. I understand this changes things considerably, particularly given your recent adjustment to life within this pack. I don't wish to pressure you into anything you're not ready for. Kale, Mira said, reaching out to gently touch his arm, feeling the warmth radiating from him even through the light fabric of his sleeve. I've spent my entire life being told that I mattered less than everyone around me, that my voice, my feelings, my very existence held less weight than others, simply because of a label assigned to me as a child. You were the first person who ever looked at me and saw something worth valuing, worth protecting, worth genuinely caring about. I'm not frightened by this bond. I welcome it. Something in Kale's expression shifted then, the careful restraint he had maintained finally giving way to open, unguarded emotion. Then will you accept this bond fully, he asked. Will you stand beside me, not merely as an honored protector within this pack, but as my equal, my partner, the Luna who will help guide these people alongside me? Mira felt the weight of his question settle over her, understanding fully the magnitude of what he was offering. Not merely acceptance into his pack, not merely protection from harm, but genuine partnership, equal standing beside the alpha king of the northern wolves. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion coursing through her. I accept. Kale's expression broke into something Mira had never seen from him before. Pure, unguarded joy that transformed his usually composed features into something younger, freer, entirely genuine. He reached up gently to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the tears that had escaped down her cheek. You saved my life during that storm, he said softly, expecting nothing in return. Now I intend to spend the rest of mine ensuring you never again feel overlooked, undervalued, or forgotten. You will stand beside me as an equal, and this pack, and every pack that hears our story, will know exactly the strength and worth that true character carries, regardless of the labels others might try to assign. He leaned down slowly, giving Mira every opportunity to step back if she chose, though she found herself leaning forward instead, meeting him fully, as their lips finally touched in a moment that felt like the culmination of everything that had unfolded since that fateful night in the blizzard. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Cale rested his forehead gently against hers, a soft smile playing at his lips. "The pack will need to be told properly," he said. "A formal announcement, a ceremony befitting the bonding of an alpha king to his fated mate." "I don't need grand ceremonies," Mira said softly. "I only need this. You, choosing me, exactly as I am." "You'll have both," Cale said, pulling back slightly to meet her gaze fully. "Because you deserve every recognition this pack can offer, and because I intend for the entire Northern Wolves territory, and every neighboring pack besides, to understand clearly that the woman standing beside their king is there because of her own strength, her own compassion, her own unshakable character, not merely because of fate or convenient circumstance." In the weeks that followed, the formal bonding ceremony between Cale and Mira became the largest celebration the Northern Wolves territory had witnessed in generations, drawing representatives from neighboring packs, including, somewhat awkwardly but genuinely, a delegation from Ashfall led by Victor himself, who offered his congratulations with considerably more sincerity than he had managed during his earlier attempts at damage control. Mira stood before the gathered crowds on the day of her formal bonding, dressed in garments that reflected both her new status and her own personal history, small embroidered details woven into the fabric representing the mountain herbs she had once gathered alone, unnoticed, before that fateful storm changed everything. As Cale took her hand before the assembled crowd, formally declaring their bond before his entire pack and the gathered representatives from beyond, Mira felt the weight of every year she had spent believing herself unworthy finally lift away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty of exactly who she was and exactly what she deserved. "This woman," Cale announced to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly, "found 6 strangers dying in a blizzard and chose compassion over caution, kindness over convenience, courage over the comfortable safety of walking away. She asked for nothing in return, expected nothing, and yet through her own character alone, she has earned a place beside me that no rank or title could ever properly capture. She is not simply my mate, she is proof that true strength has never been measured by the circumstances of one's birth, but by the choices we make when no one is watching, when nothing compels us except our own hearts." The crowd's cheers rose around them, and Mira felt Cale's hand tighten gently around her own, a silent promise of everything still to come, of a future built not on the arbitrary hierarchies that had once defined her existence, but on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and a love that had begun in the coldest night of a mountain blizzard, and had grown, steadily and surely, into something neither of them would ever again take for granted. As the celebrations continued long into the evening, Mira looked out across the gathered faces, people who had once been strangers now bound to her through fate, circumstance, and choice, and understood finally that the Omega who had saved a pack from the snow had, in turn, been given something far greater in return, a place where she truly belonged.